Hello and welcome to CrossTalk, where all things are considered. I'm Peter Lavelle. The end of a love story. Will tensions in the U.S. German relationship determine the fate of NATO? And if elected, will Joe Biden be America's version of the Soviet ruler Leonid Brezhnev? To discuss this and more, I'm joined by my guest, Glenn Diesen in Oslo. He is an associate professor at the University of Southeastern Norway, as well as author of Russia's Geoeconomic Strategy for a Greater Eurasia. And in Budapest, we have George Szamuely. He is author of Bombs for Peace, NATO's Humanitarian War on Yugoslavia. All right, gentlemen, CrossTalk rules in effect. That means you can jump in anytime you want, and I always appreciate it. Okay, let's go to Oslo first. There's a lot of discussion about Trump's decision to move, I think, 12,000 troops out of Germany. And the theme is that coming out of the White House, Germany is not paying its NATO bills. But I'm not satisfied with that explanation. Oh, by the way, it's bipartisan. It's a bad idea. Everyone that knows me watching this program, I think NATO should be dissolved completely. But nonetheless, Glenn, the top line story here is misplaced. This is about a fraught relationship that Germany has had within NATO with the United States leading that alliance. Since the end of the 1940s, all the way to the end of the Cold War in 1991. So there's something much bigger in play here. Go ahead, Glenn.
Well, Trump obviously is much bolder than his predecessors, but no, you are correct. This is something that has always been, some tensions in the relationship, which has always gone on. For example, throughout the Cold War, the Americans were to large extent concerned about some of the European integration. And as we remember, after the Cold War, you had Madeleine Albright cautioning the Europeans that the EU should not decouple from NATO. Remember that NATO is the main institutions. Now, it's because, well, very simply, because European integration enables this continent to use collective bargaining power to have greater equality in relations with the United States. So this is quite normal for any country. Why would you cooperate with 27 countries seeking to negotiate from a position of strength? And they always had the incentive to deal with one state individually instead on a bilateral basis and then maximize their influence. However, the US has nonetheless very much supported European integration, at least to a certain extent, because it provides the United States with a very powerful ally. But it's very important to recognize this dilemma that the US has always faced. So a strong EU weakens the US within the West. However, a stronger partnership with the EU then also becomes a source of collective hegemony in the West. So you empower a strong partner so you can rule together. Now, I think now in the last few years, this relationship has begun to change, largely because of the rise of Asia, with China at the center, because the US wants to spend less on Europe. This already began with Obama. However, they want more loyalty to the US in terms of use our energy, our technologies, our corporations, our transportation corridors, banks, etc., etc. So, and on the other side, the Europeans, they want more autonomy. So, and at the same time, they still want the Americans to pay for security. So this is a relationship that's always been, it has had some tensions and it's always been negotiated. And I think what we're seeing now, it has to be redefined. And I think it's a mistake to simply dismiss it as, Trumping erratic.
Exactly.
Not saying that he's not erratic, but yeah.
Well, I mean, erratic, you move the troops to another country like Poland, okay, which the U.S. promised it wouldn't do at the end of the Cold War. Also, I find it really quite amusing that, this bipartisan hair on fire is that, it's going to cost too much money to relocate these assets here. George, they never complain about the cost of the military when they're escalating, but they do complain when they de-escalate. Quite interesting. Go ahead, George.
No, that's exactly right. It's the one item in the budget that never causes any controversy in Washington. That's the military budget. That just sails through. Trump proposes $730 billion. The Democrats say $770 billion. All right, let's split the difference. Let's make it $765 billion. I mean, it just waltzes through for all the apparent controversy and the bitter fighting between the Democrats and Republicans, militaries. And of course, in this case, Trump's proposal to withdraw these 12,000 troops from Germany has indeed been attacked bilaterally. I mean, both Democrats and Republicans have condemned Trump's withdrawal. And of course, that's always the case the moment there's any discussion of withdrawing US troops from anywhere. So whether it's Syria, again, bipartisan hysteria, withdraw from Afghanistan, bipartisan hysteria. And remember, I mean, with the whole story of the Russian bounties on US servicemen, you know, the story only wheeled out precisely at the time when it seemed like, wait, US troops are about to leave. So just as when Trump wants to withdraw from Syria, we suddenly hear about the gallant Kurds. We must save the Kurds. The Kurds are the greatest ally in the world. So I would expect at some point, you know, maybe next week, some stories along the lines of there's some Russian-German plot taking place in Berlin. Putin is engineering some kind of a major crisis in Germany. So we absolutely mustn't withdraw any troops from Germany. So this always fits into a pattern. And of course, you're absolutely right. With withdrawing troops from Germany, in fact, you know, making steps to, you know, bring this NATO, this museum relic that serves no political or strategic purpose to an end, can only be a good thing. I mean, sadly, I think we're still a long way from that, but at least it seems like a step in that direction.
You know, but Glenn, you know, and reading the mainstream media press on this topic here, never once did I come across that public opinion poll consistently in Germany would like to see the American troops leave their country 75 years after the vanquishing of Nazi Germany. But it's never mentioned in the press that, you know, the troops there are just not wanted, they're not needed. And really what this what's coming into fore here, and in your first answer was quite eloquent, is that you just have American exceptionalism against European ideas of security, and they're clashing. Go ahead, Glenn.
Yeah, well, the mission of NATO has changed because, well, initially when it came to place, the whole argument was that Western Europe was very much weakened from the war, and the Americans needed to stay there until they could be temporarily strengthened and then leave. I mean, this was the famous quote by Eisenhower when he was the supreme commander of NATO. He argued that, you know, in 1951, he argued if we're still there in 10 years, this whole mission would have failed because we didn't build up the Europeans and then pull back. Well, now the situation has changed radically. For one, there is no Soviet Union. Second, Europe is very much rebuilt. But as we discussed before, the key purpose now is this power structure which emerged during the Cold War, which is the US pays for security and the Europeans largely do as they're told. But you're also correct that there is a discrepancy between the political leadership and the population. I mean, almost every year they do these polls. Where does the greatest threat to international security come from? And almost all of America's allies say the United States. So that there is this, this difficulty in the relations now. With the Trump argument, though, I think within Washington you get two different perspectives. One is Trump's argument essentially, you know, we have to punish the Germans because they don't do as we're told. And if you're shifting the troops around, then you're essentially punishing them. So from Trump's perspective, he's actually saving NATO by having this punishment and reward based on their loyalty to the United States. It's more from Congress, you get this other perspective, which is, you know, if you alienate, you know, the Europeans, the Germans, then effectively you're handing them over to the Russians and Chinese. And this could be a Kremlin conspiracy, you know.
Well, like it's actually very multidimensional because, George, I mean, ever since Trump talked about it when he was a candidate and now president, is that there's been a theory out there is that, you know, forcing the European countries, the NATO members to spend more, with these NATO members would realize, well, why are we spending so much money? Because there really isn't a threat to our security here. And that would be a way for Trump to say, see, if I force you to pay more, you don't want to pay more, then you see that there is no threat. Yeah, I mean, and it actually is kind of coming to fruition in a very weird way. Go ahead, George.
Yes, that was the argument, and that's a very reasonable one, which is that you know, okay, you telling us that you're terribly frightened. There's this terrible big Russian bear in the east. Okay, fine, then pay some more. You know, why are we protecting you? You're the one who's supposedly in the front line. And so when they say, well, yeah, I know we said we're in the front line, but we don't actually mean that we're going to spend more, they said, okay, fine, then we're not going to spend any more. And so that was a reasonable argument. But Trump also had a deeper argument, which is that Europe has become an economic rival to the United States. I mean, it was one thing to build up, Europe's defenses in the 1950s and 1960s, but even from the 1970s on, West Germany, and as it was called at the time, was now becoming a serious economic rival to the United States. Now, 45, 50 years on, we can see the results of this. And so therefore, it does make very little sense for the United States to be subsidizing a power that is really an economic giant. I mean, this makes absolutely no sense. And Trump realizes this, but of course, there's a huge, powerful, well-oiled Atlanticist establishment that is absolutely hell-bent on thwarting any attempt to disentangle this relationship.
Yeah, there are just too many careers built on this. Okay, I mean, and the 5,000 NATO bureaucrats on the continent as well. I mean, that's been their entire future. Glenn, one of the interesting things that I find interesting is that with this, I mean, the Poles want to build Fort Trump. They want American troops permanently stationed in Poland. Again, that would be against the agreements made ending the confrontation in Europe with the dissolving of the Warsaw Pact. But doesn't Poland standing like this, its position, doesn't that really divide NATO internally even more? Because it shows that there is no kind of unified understanding of what the alliance is supposed to do. I mean, this is an alliance in search of a mission, and the Poles are stepping up and defining it for the rest of the member countries. Go ahead.
Well, that was already a concern by when Poland and the others joined NATO, because after the Cold War, there was some concern among, for example, Germany, that they didn't want to pinpoint Russia as a threat. They believed that it was able to find some working relationship with them. Meanwhile, the Poles pretty much just wanted to be on the other side of the wall, so continue it as an anti-Russian alliance. Now, the solution for NATO, what do you do if the Western Europeans don't want to name Russia as a threat and the Eastern Europeans want to label Russia a threat? The solution was essentially strategic ambiguity. We're just about democracy, stable government, and we're friends to Russia, and effectively the guarantee was once Russia pushes against the expansionism, then that would trigger this security guarantee in which it converts from being this organization for democracy to again containing Russia. So that was a strategic ambiguity all along.
You need huge military budgets to defend European democracy. I'm not sure I really comprehend that. Gentlemen, I'm going to jump in here. We're going to go to a short break, and after that short break, we'll continue our discussion on some real news. Stay with RT. Welcome back to CrossTalk, where all things are considered. I'm Peter Lavelle. To remind you, we're talking about some real news. Okay, George, let's switch gears here. None of us are doctors here, obviously, but we're all perceptive about politics. That's what we do basically for a living in one form or another. And watching Joe Biden, I mean, it's quite shocking that we've gotten down to a candidate that the Democrats have rallied behind, if tepidly, that is challenged, okay? He's challenged in a variety of ways here. Now, we all know that this is, domestically, this is all an anti-Trump gambit. That's very, very clear, okay? It's not voting for Joe, it's voting against Donald Trump. But if we do have this Biden administration, the implications are enormous. How would the outside world see this? Who's in charge? Interagency consensus? Who's in charge of that? I mean, it would send a very ambiguous message to the international system. Go ahead, George.
Yes, that's entirely right. What's very sad here is, of course, how cynical the Democrats have been in all of this. After all, Biden's physical and mental deterioration was apparent throughout the primaries. Everybody could see it. I mean, the candidates themselves on the stage were seen to be sniggering at his obvious decrepitude. Yet they all rallied around him, they endorsed him. Why was this? Because they were absolutely determined to defeat Donald Trump, and they thought that Lunch Bucket Joe, with his supposed links to the industrial Midwest, would somehow be the one person who could be absolutely guaranteed to defeat Trump. Now, it's becoming clear that this is really very problematic, as people do see him, that this is, how can he last 4 years, let alone 8 years? So who is going to be running the country? Now, as far as the outside world is concerned, well, there are no doubt the Atlanticist establishment types who are very powerful in Europe, who would welcome, oh, it's great, it's the return of the Obama crowd, all the safe pair of hands.
Or George, or maybe the flip side of what you just said is that an empty vessel that we can fill. Yes?
Yes, that's right. So that's exactly. They'll tell him, oh, Russia's a threat. We got to, spend more here, move troops here. I'll go along with all that. So yes, no doubt they're happy about this, but it's a very dangerous situation because you have somebody in the Oval Office who really isn't up to the job. So he could either make an absolutely reckless, foolish decision, or the decision will be made by people who have not been elected to anything and who have their own agenda.
That's the point. That Glenn. Historically, we had Winston Churchill in his second stint as prime minister. He exhibited mental deficiencies. Obviously, Brezhnev, the Soviet leader, he died in power, and even Ronald Reagan, in the waning days of his second term in office, it became obvious that he was having some problems as well. Now, I'm describing three important historical individuals at the end of their government power service. Okay, we're talking about a guy that's going in to the White House. I mean, that should send up alarm bells, shouldn't it? Go ahead, Glenn.
Yeah, and I guess that's the key difference, that it's not at the end of his term. I agree with what was said before. I think that the idea of Biden is why they want to bring him in, because, well, Biden's a household name. He was part of the old guard. He was with Obama. And this is very much an anti-Trump platform. And the message of this campaign will be return to the normal. And he essentially represents the past. So this idea of Biden, but that's the idea. The reality is obviously very different, with his cognitive abilities declining apparently quite rapidly. And I also agree that there's a sense of hypocrisy there as well, because keep in mind that the Democrats have all, for the last 4 years now, been criticizing the mental state of Trump. I would say quite reasonably pointing to his narcissism, but now they're running a candidate who is seemingly struggling with dementia. So it doesn't bring up a lot of moral issues. And for one, well, it's all about winning now, of course, but what happens after he wins? First day of office, he can't string together a simple sentence. I think, yes, it's going to be quite unprecedented. For the rest of his allies, especially in Europe, they're going to see, one they like more than Trump, but also one that's not well qualified to lead. So, and again, as you mentioned, very much this empty vessel.
Yeah, well, George, I mean, one of the most important elements to keep the international system stable is certainty. What can you expect? I mean, in this case, I mean, when I look at, the last 3.5 years, Trump on the margins pushed back against this interagency consensus, but we could have a man in the White House in January that will have no resistance whatsoever. It's just he'll sign, I'll sign anything. I mean, and then who's making those decisions? The Vindmans of the world, unelected bureaucrats. That's going to create a lot of uncertainty in my mind. Go ahead.
Yes, and what we've seen during the Trump years and before is that unelected bureaucracy is a public menace. They have been pushing their agenda. They have ignored the elected president, the one who actually ran on the platform. They've simply said, well, we don't care about his policy, the policy he ran on. We are the people who are in charge because, as you say, we are the interagency consensus. So if that was a dangerous situation, how much more likely would this be under Biden? I mean, they'll tell Biden, well, enjoy yourself, have a good time. You don't have to do anything, spend time with your family, playing croquet or whatever you want to do. We'll run everything. And who are the people going to be running it? I mean, they will be people like Vindman, Fiona Hill, all of that crowd who kind of came out of the woodwork during the Trump years. Were quite frightening in their kind of pathological view of the world. They will be in charge. And this is a really serious threat to democracy. I mean, what is the point of having elections if the people who are running it, the country, have nothing to do with any of these elections? They didn't run on anything.
Yeah, well, that's a perfect good point there, because it just shows the continued divorce between foreign policy issues and the democratic process. Okay, Glenn, one of the things I find really disturbing is that in the last 3.5 years, Trump's foreign policy has been all over the place. I think that's a fair assessment. But the fact that it's been all over the place has actually created debate, now mostly against him from the interagency consensus. But in a Biden administration, we won't even have that debate. It will be as if foreign policy just is completely separated off into a different realm, because whoever is assuming the Oval Office in January will have to deal with the pandemic and economic turndown, social unrest here. And what I worry is, like what George was alluding to, is that, going to have the small, little cabinet area. We'll take care of the rest, okay? And, those people taking care of the rest have a disastrous record over the last 40 years. Go ahead, Glenn.
Yeah, now I would also add that what is this going to do to the social cohesion of the country and the trust in the political class? Keep in mind that one of the reasons why people voted for Trump, even people who didn't care much for him, is they wanted to throw a wrench into the system, because the distrust of the political class and the media, for that sake, had grown to a huge level, which is pretty much the definition of populism, when the people feel that alienated from the political class. Now, they believe the political class were too distant from them, and then you have Trump in power, and the first thing they see is the political class effectively trying to take him down with this Russiagate and other ways, essentially denying the results of the election, with Hillary obviously leading it. And now, once he's don't care much for the way he leads, but nonetheless, by the time he's gone, now they're going to put in Biden, who does not have who seems to have dementia, and he seems to be this empty vessel, which, again, the political elites can control. It for those in the United States who are unhappy with how the political system is going, this is going to probably have a huge reaction, this time maybe more from the political right, who will question the legitimacy, just like the left questioned the legitimacy of Trump. The right will not recognize the legitimacy really of Biden, not because he didn't fake the election, but because his mental state.
Well, I mean, we have a political system that is now rooted in disbelief, okay? I mean, it is so partisan. George and I have talked about this privately a number of times. No matter who is declared the victor in November, the country is going to explode, okay? There's no doubt about it in my mind. George, we're rapidly running out of time. One of the things I find really, to the point of bizarre, is that you have this Black Lives Matter, we have, tackling systemic racism and all of that whole narrative that is in the wake of the Biden juggernaut, as it were, in the basement. But I mean, there's no reflection that the American foreign policy, for particularly since the end of the Second World War, has dealt very, very harshly with people of color around the world. You can look at Southeast Asia, you can look at Iraq, you can look at Afghanistan, you look at Syria. I mean, there's no reflection, is there? I mean, it's all internal. They don't see how foreign policy has been played out to the detriment of their quote unquote own values about fighting racism. Go ahead, George.
Yes, that's a very, very good point. That's exactly that kind of absolute hypocrisy. Oh, we really care about, people of color, except when they're living abroad. I mean, then we really don't care about them. Then they just become missile targets. So apparently Syrians, they're not people of color. Iraqis, they're not people of color. We can just bomb them to smithereens. But just going back to the point about what the agenda of the interagency consensus, there is no question that these people want revenge against Russia. I mean, they are furious still over 2016. And one of the most dangerous aspects of a Biden presidency will be this crowd that will look for payback against Russia. I mean, and I think
for what they alleged, based on allegations, a myth and a hoax. Okay. Geez, the political left really is a cult, okay? Because it's not based on empirical evidence. It's based on fury, resentment, and revenge. That's what we might get in January. All right, gentlemen, that's all the time we have. I want to thank my guests in Oslo and Budapest, and I want to thank our viewers for watching us here at RT. See you next time. Remember, crosstalk rules.